So welcome everybody. My name is Vili Leronvirta. I'm a research fellow here at Oxford Internet Institute. I think many of you are department members, but I think we have some visitors from outside as well, so it's very nice to have you here. And this afternoon, obviously, we're going to hear a presentation by Professor John Horton. He's a professor at the Stern School of Business, New York University. He has a PhD in public policy from Harvard University, but I think all three of his advisors were actually economists, so I think you wouldn't be wrong to call him an economist. At the same time, he's also a brilliant computer scientist. He's really a data scientist who knows how to work with data and what has since then come to be called big data. And I think John was working with that kind of data a long time ago already when this buzzword didn't exist yet. And he's also been in the enviable position, or he has worked his way up to the enviable position of being able to not only collect and analyze that data, but to be able to run experiments, interventions. So he has some unique results and unique expertise and findings that I think other social scientists working with the internet and big data are only starting to work their ways towards. Previously, he was at LSE for one summer, and so he's very well acquainted with the idiosyncrasies of the British academia. For example, he was asking me earlier if he should spell labour with U or without U.
And I did a quick find and replace,
and I can see that he went for the culturally sensitive option. So you can see he's a very generous speaker as well. And I really appreciate the fact that he's taking the trouble to come over to Europe and give us a talk. It's a very busy moment for him personally and also professionally, I know. And so I do appreciate it very much, and I'm sure you do as well. So let's all welcome John Horton.
Thank you very much. So I broke this talk into three parts. The first part is sort of about online labor markets and why I think there's something new. The second part is what I would call a fruit fly for the social sciences, explaining why we can use these to do basic social science research. And the last part of the talk is to talk about the sort of the policy implications that these kind of markets raise. So the first part is part one. Suppose I wanted someone to do something for me, build a website, verify some business listings, create a logo, enter some data into a spreadsheet, something that could potentially be done by someone who was anywhere. Well, I could take and just go to Craigslist, okay? And Craigslist's free. It's thick for many types of goods and services, and it's popular for in-person jobs. So there are substantial job listings on Craigslist. And yet, it lacks a number of things. There's no tools to verify worker quality. There's no safe way to pay workers, at least online. There's no neutral third party that's going to arbitrate disputes or enforce any kind of contracts that you might write. And there's no sort of structured contractual form. You're sort of on your own in terms of making some kind of an arrangement with whoever you might hire. The limitations of Craigslist as a market is creating an entire industry. So I didn't create this slide. It was actually created by a venture capitalist that invests in a lot of these marketplace businesses. And practically everything you see being traded on Craigslist, there's some kind of startup that's trying to make a marketplace to facilitate transactions for that thing, including labor. So Odesk is one such market. It's a marketplace for tasks that can be done remotely. So you should be thinking of things like computer programming, graphic design. It's primarily a marketplace for hourly types of work. And people form employment-like contracts. In 2011, the wage bill was about $220 million US dollars. And it's growing at about 90% a year. And their business model is quite simple. They mediate these transactions and they take 10% of the total wage bill. So just some disclosure, I worked at Odes from 2011 to just a few months ago as their staff economist, and I still have a consulting arrangement with the company. So this is what a profile looks like.
Sorry,
yes?
What is the relationship between Odesk and Craigslist?
Nothing.
They're just competitors, okay, so it's not...
Yeah, I was giving an example of something sort of the status quo and companies emerging as a response to the limitations of this. This is what a profile looks like for a worker. You can see a number of things. They have their job history on site. You have the hours that they've worked, feedback on past jobs, results of skills tests. So there's a lot of very rich information about a worker that a buyer might be interested in. Now that being said, not all of it is completely verifiable. So if you start Googling Odes test, the auto-suggester, all the ways that you can cheat on said tests. Which is not a bad thing in the sense that it means that people take it seriously enough to bother cheating. And you maybe even employers might want to select on people who go through the effort of cheating, but I'll leave that alone. And when a contract is actually formed, one thing that's quite interesting, is sort of like a novel feature of this marketplace, is that the worker actually installs tracking software on their computer, and at periodic but random intervals, it takes screenshots of what they're working on, so that the employer who's paying their hourly wages can look and see if they're not goofing off and going on Facebook. What this does is, as long as the worker is taking and submitting to this monitoring, they get paid for their hours. And this is actually, I think, a very important difference between something like Craigslist, but I'll talk more about that later. So let me just give you some statistics on who is buying and who is selling in this marketplace. This chart shows quarterly wage bill over time, going back to 2009. The solid line is employers in high-income countries, as defined by the World Bank, and the low is low-income countries. And basically what you can see, I think this is supposed to be red. It's coming through very poorly. I don't know if... Well, okay, so a lot of my callouts are not showing up.
Red.
But
Okay.
yeah, this right here is a... Anyway, I know what they say, so I will. So what you can see down here is that the low-income countries, they're basically the employers are not present. This is primarily employers in wealthy countries hiring workers in less wealthy countries. Now, this is the same time series, but broken down by where the contractor is from. So you can see that when we look at that, workers from high-income countries make up some share of the workforce, but still most of the earnings come from workers that are coming from low-income countries. Now, if you took and broke down and said, okay, here's the world population in millions on the x-axis, and the y-axis is the number of contractors that have ever worked on Odes, you can see an overrepresentation of countries that have a substantial English-speaking population. So India is way above trend, the United States, Philippines, Bangladesh, Pakistan. Some exceptions, here's Ukraine. But a lot of the market seems to be organized around people who can speak English. And I haven't really dug into it, but we know geography at a much finer level of detail. So this is just plotting the locations of workers who say they're from India by their geocoded address, and the size of the bubbles is just the quantity of workers. So if you want, you can go down to a much more granular level of geography. So what's getting bought and what's getting sold and at what price in this marketplace? Well, it's primarily... Web programming makes up a big chunk of it. A lot of this is computer programming, but you do see some sort of lower skilled data entry, sort of web content writing, SEO, SEM, but still technical work makes up the majority of what's in the marketplace.
Sorry, web programming.
Yes.
How is that different from programming in general? I mean, what is that category?
More around the technologies. So web programming would be, HTML, CSS, say a PHP or some like server-side language, versus people who are doing other kind of computer programming, usually like scripts, utilities, desktop apps, things like that. Yeah, I mean, we also break down mobile apps. I mean, I actually find it useful to think of the market as technical and non-technical. I don't draw a huge, especially you kind of see some convergence of technology. So like Python, is that a web technology? Well, people use it for that, but it's also for all sorts of other things. This chart just shows growth over time by type. This is technical work. So you can see when the market started out, it was almost entirely technical work. And then over time, we've seen a growing share of non-technical work by volume. So this is average wages over time. Basically, they've been flat. You've seen some growth in software development, maybe a slight decline in web development, but for the most part, prices seem to be staying about the same. And you can see relatively low prices in data entry and customer service type work. So this is $5 an hour. This is about $6 an hour. And relatively high paying work in software development, web development. Nothing too surprising there. People tend to be getting paid according to the difficulty of the skills involved. So what's driving this kind of development, this emergence of these kind of markets? Well, I mean, still there's enormous unarbitraged differences in the returns to human capital around the world. This is probably one of the most obvious facts about geography. Now, we don't actually have any workers for North Korea, but this is a very stark exhibit of geographic differences driving differences in sort of economic activity. And
probably not that much human capital in North Korea.
Well, hopefully there is.
For technical work,
yes.
for web programming.
Maybe hacking and counterfeiting U.S. $100 bills, but not for not for programming. So we also have a sort of a ever-improving technology that's eroding the importance of geographic co-location for collaboration. And these are all tools that we're familiar with that are making it more feasible to do this kind of work. And then the global proliferation of low-cost, high-bandwidth ICT. It's becoming easier and easier to take and find people that can actually connect to you and you can work with them. And then also just the maturity in ways to make global payments. This is actually a surprisingly high source of friction in facilitating these kind of markets, is it's not actually easy to make point-to-point payments around the world, even today. So what's determining prices in these markets? Well, I mean, I think anything you have to start with presuming that it's some notion of supply and demand. But I think the question that is sort of on everyone's mind is, well, does this new supply that gets opened up, is it just displacing workers that sort of would have been hired locally, or is it actually, say, exposing kinds of workers that wouldn't have been hired? That whatever there was work that could have been done that was below the reservation price of the workers in that local economy. Well, so in other words, is this just wage arbitrage, or is it something else? Well, so I just did a survey, and they asked clients. Now, you can kind of take these are employers. Some, self-reports, how much do you believe them? That's sort of always a question, but they asked them, what would you have done if there was no appropriate online worker for the task that you wanted to do? And only 17% of them said, I would have hired someone locally. The vast majority said, I would have done something else, and most of it was they would have worked their extra hours themselves to later cancel the project, done something else, not sure. So it sounds like people are saying that this is not just they're taking in work that they would have done locally, they're just getting it at a lower price. It's sort of changing sort of how much work gets done. But the question remains, are online and traditional workers substitutes or complements? So the thing kind of like a simplistic substitutes complements framing, you can kind of think of wine and beer as generally thought of as substitutes, and say beer and salty snacks as complements. And I don't have an answer for this, but say this is a programmer in San Francisco and Silicon Valley. Do we think of his counterpart in India as someone who's just a substitute for him, or is it someone who actually potentially makes him more productive? And that's not as implausible as it might seem. There's actually a lot of cases where you have a job that's a mixture of tasks, some of which are high value and some of which are low value. And if I can outsource the low value tasks, me and the guy in San Francisco, I might actually be more productive, more valued to my employer. It might increase my demand. I don't have an answer to this, but I think it's probably one of the key questions that determines how we think about this. Yes?
Sorry, how does this fit with the fact that a lot of very big computer companies like Yahoo and Microsoft and Google, they are cutting the hours people can actually work from remote, and they're asking more and more their employees to come at work in the same together in a place?
Well, I don't know. What's that?
Would you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question is, so what about, say, like Yahoo, which seems to be moving towards a more centralized approach versus a decentralized approach? I mean, my take one, Yahoo is an exceptional case. This is a company that was sort of really going in a bad direction and people weren't working. I think that no one would deny that working together with people that are physically co-located still is better. It's easier to collaborate people whether you're physically co-located. The question, I think, is sort of how much degradation do you suffer by being remotely, and what is that worth in price, right? So, a fully loaded software engineer in Silicon Valley is $250,000 a year is probably what you should think of. If I can get that work done in India at, even if it's half as good, but if it's a quarter of the price, maybe that's a deal I'm willing to take. So I think it's the question is sort of trade-offs, right? I don't think the point is that it's always better to be together or remote. It's a question of what margin do you care about. So are there any productivity gains from online work? So this is actually kind of sort of related to your question. Is there anything we think might be special about it? Well, I think this is a little bit speculative, but if you go back to Adam Smith and he talked about what's the source of what's an important source of productivity gains, he said, well, it's the specialization of labor. So if I can take my pin factory and have each person specializing in a certain task, one nice property of these markets is that if you're accessing a global pool of buyers and a global pool of sellers, you potentially can get this extreme form of specialization where a worker could do something for which the total global demand is only 40 hours a week. I mean, this is sort of analogous to one of the reasons people think there's great agglomeration economies in cities is that you can get a similar kind of specialization. But the online work, at least in principle, might promote this kind of enhancement. So at this point, you might be asking, is this just offshoring? What's new? We've been talking about offshoring for a really long time. Is there anything qualitatively different about it? I think there's two things. So one, throughout history, labor markets, specifically labor markets, have been strongly segmented by geography. People have had to live very close to their employers. And to the extent that these markets make that not true, that's kind of a fundamental change. So if you think about offshoring, it's usually these arm's length contracts between firms. It's usually not an individual firm hiring an individual worker through a labor market with that worker not being physically co-located with them. The second is that these markets facilitate employment-like relationships rather than arm's length contracts. And I think that there's a good argument to me that that's a fundamentally different economic arrangement. So this is something economists have long recognized, that employment is just different from an arm's length contract between firms. It creates different incentives, it lets different things be possible. If you think about, if you do a comparison, say an employment contract and an arm's length contract, in what parties contract upon with an employment contract, it's inputs. You come and work some number of hours, and I'll pay you. It's usually not, if you produce these things, then you're going to get dollars that are tied to whatever you do. Whereas an arm's length contract is usually precisely that. There's some service level agreement and we're contracting upon outputs. The institutional requirements for an employment contract are actually quite low. It's usually at will. If it's not working out, we just dissolve the relationship. Whereas institutional requirements for an arm's length contract tend to be very high. You need courts to enforce contracts. So these two, well, the red, it doesn't really show up, but these two things are difficult online. It's hard to contract upon inputs if I can't observe what you're doing, and it's hard to contract upon outputs if we're cross-national and we don't have some institutional framework to enforce rights.
Sorry, could you say the first thing again?
Mm-hmm. So what's hard online? So what's hard online about these two types of contracts? And it's hard to have an employment contract if I need to contract upon inputs, if I can't physically observe you providing these inputs.
But outputs are fine. Right.
Outputs are fine because I can just pay you on those. The only thing that makes them complicated is that if we get to some bad outcome where there's a dispute, we need some institutional framework to decide sort of who did what was verifiable. So what I think of online labor markets as doing is they're trying to solve these problems for employment. So remember I showed you that screen monitoring technology. I think what that did was it allowed people to contract upon inputs, which sort of opened up employment possibilities, which didn't exist before. So I kind of see that as a sort of a key technology that made something possible that wasn't there before. Employment allows greater flexibility to adapt, so we're not going to constantly be haggling over changes if we tried to write a complete contract and then the world changes. And sometimes you can get better incentives, so there's a reason I think that most employers give their employees fairly weak financial incentives. They're worried about crowding out other behaviors that are hard to monitor. There's an enormous literature on sort of the costs and benefits of using strong incentives in relationships. And employment sometimes is the best solution. I think it's probably why it's so widespread. So what do you need for a labor relationship? Well, you need a way to pay people. You need a way to evaluate applicants and employers. You need a way to measure inputs and outputs, a way to communicate with each other, a way to adjudicate disputes, and a way to find applicants and vacancies. So both sides need to find. And what's unique about these online markets, in each of these cases, the marketplace that's online has to create these things sort of from scratch. A lot of what exists in the traditional market just doesn't exist here. So the firm is constantly, the platform that's created these markets is constantly faced with these design choices to try to fill in the things that are missing online. And I think in a sense that's the business that all of these firms are in, is basically filling in these things that we take for granted in traditional markets. Okay, so that's sort of my part one, sort of what these things are, why I think they matter. Is there any questions about sort of anything I've talked about here? Yes?
Can you give the size? I mean, because then even if they equates $200 million or so.
So I have a slide on this in the future, sort of to the extent of these things are so small you shouldn't care about them. But so last year, one industry group said it's $1 billion. By 2018, it may be $5 billion. So if you know how much money is spent on labor, that's nothing, right? And I think that this is sort of, I don't want to get too far into sort of how I think we should think about these in a policy sense, but my main point is we shouldn't think about them too much. Yes?
Did we talk about taxes and benefits in part 3, or?
Yes, a little bit.
And then just let me get this straight. So
You put all the emphasis on online solving the kind of contractual part. But the thing that I didn't hear you get squared away is the geographical part. Because on the one hand you said it's not kind of offshoring on the whole. But on the other hand, then you went into that this is the kind of main reason that companies might have for doing this, i.e. that the labor that's not available at a certain wage in one place is available elsewhere.
Yes.
But those two things don't match up, if you see what I mean. Or do they?
No, so I think that they want to be able to hire.
More work is created, but so that makes sense.
Yes.
But otherwise, unless you're substituting one thing for another, why should people need labor elsewhere?
Oh well, so, I mean, there's many things that you wouldn't do at a certain price. So if I can't hire anyone, I can think of things. So just to give you an example, when I was walking around today, I was taking pictures of people's bookshelves, right? Because I want to see what books they're reading, things I might want to buy. I couldn't go back to San Francisco and hire someone to do that for less than probably $25 an hour. However, I can hire someone from the Philippines to take and go through those books and find the ISBNs and the links on Amazon for probably $2.50 an hour. So there's like some labor that I just wouldn't have done, and now I will because I have access to it. Now, there's a chance that maybe I would have hired someone and I'm displacing it. But it's not purely displacement. It's some combination of more work being created and displacement. Yes.
So you had this slide with the question about what the employers would have done had this affordance not been available. I wondered if you had a similar question addressed to the employees.
Yes. Sorry, I should repeat these questions. So we know that employers give reasons what they would have done. The question is, do we know what workers would have done otherwise? Unfortunately, no. We haven't done that kind of a survey, but that would be really interesting to kind of get some sense of what their outside options are. Yes.
Do you know the average project length on Odesk? Because what is it, for example?
Well, it depends. It's pretty strongly dependent by category, but I think the average size is about $5,000. So if you took and divided through by 20 or whatever, you probably get some measure of the length. Okay. But it's very high. Almost everything on Odesk is log normally distributed for whatever reason. So things like that, the mean might actually be not a very representative, right? You have a lot of these like relationships that have lasted a very long time and a lot that like very, very short period. Yes?
Have you seen a tipping point so far where this was about sort of people taking work to lower wage economies, and do you think it's that perhaps you can't do the same price elsewhere?
Sure.
But reversing it, could you actually, many of the case studies I've seen is where people are actually finding people with better skills and capability than they might be able to find locally. So this
Yes.
this spiral down, you've also got the spiral up, so you've actually got more people to choose from that may have greater capability to actually perform the task you actually want to do.
Yes, so I think that's very true, and actually I have a slide that shows people saying why they didn't fill their vacancies, and it's very rarely they couldn't find someone at the right price. It's like I couldn't find anyone with the right skills, and those people are out there. It's just very hard to find them. There's this kind of enormous coordinating problem. A lot of times employers don't really know what they know what they want. They don't really know what that's called in the marketplace. And a lot of what the marketplace is trying to do is translate, okay, you want a website, well, you need these technologies to do it, and then here are the workers that you need. This sort of matching and coordination function is actually a big part of what this does. And in my part 2, I'll talk a little bit about an experiment that we did to address this. Okay, so I'm going to move on to part 2. So the fruit fly. So fruit flies are what's called a model organism in the sciences. There's other examples. So there's lab mice, there's chimpanzees, there's the tobacco mosaic virus. These are organisms that receive tons of research effort, not because we fundamentally care about them as a species. It's that they're easy to use to do science. It's easy and ethical to experiment on them. They're easy to dissect. They're easy to observe. And depending on what the question is, we usually get good enough external validity out of it. So in the case of the biological sciences, because of common descent, a lot of evolutionary sort of problems are solved once, and we can sort of make easy comparisons. And I think these markets have there's some analogies that are true between these markets and model organisms, and that they, at least for labor markets, all the sort of the moving pieces of a labor market are there and captured in silico. So just talk about dissection and observation. So these markets throw off an enormous amount of data. So I don't have a good visual for data, so I just use the ubiquitous matrix reification of data. But the idea is that there's an enormous amount of data that's captured by these markets. Just by necessity of running some online site, you capture almost everything that happens in a large relational database for free. Much of the data is about phenomena that's just not observable in conventional markets. And to give you an example, so why this matters? Well, our knowledge in the social sciences is also often thinnest about the things that we don't get to observe empirically. And a lot of theoretical ambiguity is tied back to sort of questions that are empirical but we don't have good ways of answering. So a lot of times if you get some data that can shed light on some theoretical ambiguity, you can kind of get a nice advance in where you're going. To give you one example from some work, there's kind of an open question when you see a firm post a vacancy and then you see it go for some period of time and then the firm pulls it off. You don't know if during that whole time were they still accruing applicants and they just hadn't made a decision, or was it they got all the applicants they were ever going to get and it was most of the time was the firm screening. There's no national way of sort of collecting up every applicant that arrives to a job and sort of learning why they did it, and the statistical agencies don't get to that fine level of detail. On Odesk, you have when people apply to the job down to the millisecond. You have down to the millisecond when they actually choose to hire people. So on Odesk, you can see this is the distribution of hours after a job is posted, the distribution of arrivals. So you see that sort of this early spike where like insiders who know about the job apply immediately, and then you see this tail, but then you can also see this is the distribution of employers making decisions, and you can see it sort of right shifted. What basically the kind of stylized fact here is vacancies are getting all their applicants very, very quickly, and most of the time it's unfilled as the employer making a decision about who to hire. Yes?
Just one quick question. I can't see the timeline on that. What sort of timelines are you looking at from start to finish?
Oh, so it's a log scale, so this is 1 hour, 24 hours, and 1 week. So actually you can see that, at least for applications, the modal application comes less than 24 hours after a job is posted. So this is like a very, very quick. Now, you might think this is actually very specific to Odesk, but a study of Dutch vacancies that actually did something similar to this found a similar result where most of the jobs were actually getting their applicants very, very quickly, and the firm was sitting on a more or less complete pool of applicants and making their decisions. And this kind of thing could inform sort of how we model the firm making decisions. Instead of them sampling from a flow, they're actually getting a stock and process things in batch. I don't want to get too far into this because I'm using it more just as an example of the kind of thing that you can see in these markets that is very difficult to observe otherwise and potentially can let you do some really nice social science. Just some more examples on the Odesk. You have worker test scores, the searches that they make in the marketplace, vacancies, the universe of applications, their cover letters, interviews, job offers, payments, hours worked, keystrokes. So once they're hired, down to the millisecond, sort of when they're typing. Just like this very, very, very micro measure of what's going on. Now, I'm not saying it's easy necessarily to extract meaning out of this. It's actually sort of my big pain in life. But the data is there, if you can go through the trouble of it. So something that's a bit easier than doing observational social science is doing experimentation. So several people have pointed out the potential of these marketplaces for experimentation. You can very easily run experiments that are hard to run in the physical world or in labs. And they're used because they're low cost, both direct and administrative. A lot of these sites have APIs. It's very easy to sort of make payments to thousands of people without sort of the overhead it would take if you wanted to do that in the physical world. And potentially more realism, especially for sort of work-related experiments. So I identify as a labor economist. I'm interested in people working in a labor setting. If I have people come into a lab, it's going to be undergraduates solving puzzles. People might kind of say that's not what work is like. And here I could potentially get something that looks a lot more what work is like. And this instrumentation, it also captures natural experiments that happen. So it's not just experiments that you induce. To just give you an example, this is the daily transfers of workers in India from from Odesk to their home bank accounts. And you can see right here, PayPal goes down in India, shuts down for like a 2-week period. No transfers are possible. And you can see here's Odesk introducing a new, very attractive payment system. I don't know what the research question this would answer in, but that's like a pretty nice sort of exogenous shock to a situation that you could then take and exploit to answer questions. And these happen all the time in these sites, from bugs, from new features that come out, from policy changes. It's very conducive to this kind of natural experiment approach to doing empirical research. So now I want to talk a little bit about my own research. So my research is mostly focused on market design. And I'm primarily interested in what policies and features can we use to improve the quality, the quantity of matches, the efficiency of matches. Basically, kind of how do we get all the good things when markets are appropriate? How do we reap those benefits? And so I think as a side effect, my goal is that as I'm trying to solve this, which is essentially an engineering problem, what are sort of the more general benefits, more general insights we can get from the social sciences, for the social sciences from that kind of work? There's a lot of times you're going to sort of run up against sort of unanswered questions when you're trying to design some new mechanism. So I'm going to talk about 3 experimental examples. One on reducing search costs, one on reducing congestion, and one in trying to improve the sorting that happens in the marketplace. So I talked about these main goals of reducing congestion and search costs, increasing liquidity, increasing match quality, and then sort of the levers that you have available to you are things like making algorithmic recommendations, say to cut down on search costs, setting policies that sort of tax negative externalities and subsidize public goods. So this is kind of similar to sort of like a benevolent regulator in a market trying to subsidize things that should be subsidized and tax them, which kind of a Pigouvian approach. Provide focal points for coordination, so helping people solve the problem of where do I go to find this person to trade. And lastly, building just general tools for search, discovery, mechanisms to get people to reveal their information. So the first one I want to talk about is reducing search costs. So if you look at, here was a survey that was done of clients that posted vacancies, employers that posted vacancies, why didn't you fill it? And number 1 on the list is that they say they couldn't find a contractor with the right skills. This is very similar to how conventional employers, when they can't fill a job, they often say similar things. It's sort of a skills mismatch. They couldn't find anyone. This sounds like the kind of thing that it's a search friction. It's the kind of thing that ICT tends to be good at dealing with search frictions. So if you presume that those people are out there, the employer just couldn't find them, perhaps by giving them search tools you can help this situation. So the question I was motivated by is, can we use algorithmic recommendations to increase the fill rate? And so, why do we care? Well, one, results might generalize from the online world to the offline world. We're in a situation now where far more people have lots of match-relevant information that they've digitized through LinkedIn profiles, social networking sites. So this approach, while it's very easy to do on Odesk, I think will become easier to do in traditional markets as more and more of the supply side gets digitized. But a concern that you kind of would see in a labor market, but not in a conventional product market, is you're very worried about crowd out. So if I recommend one person, I'm potentially harming someone else, and that's going to really kind of affect how we think about recommendations if all they do is just crowd out matches that would have occurred anyway. So let me just give you an example of why we care. So imagine the firm has some vacancy. They would have hired someone in the state of the world, another firm, they had a vacancy, they didn't hire anyone. So now we make a recommendation. We assume this person's unemployed. Okay, this guy just got crowded out. He didn't get hired. We care what state of the world is more true. We'd like it to be this, but it could be this.
So I didn't get
My graphic?
Yeah.
Okay, so I say imagine if there's a firm, they would have hired someone, I make a recommendation, they hire someone else instead.
Okay.
We don't really, that's just sort of moving money around, we don't really care, right? Now imagine another world where the firm just wouldn't have hired someone, counterfactually we give them recommendations and now they will. If that's the case, we feel a lot better about recommendations than if all we're doing is crowding people out. That's it in a nutshell. That's probably better said than illustrated with my animations. I always try to not do animations, but it's so tempting. So this is an experiment that ran the summer of 2011, 2 experimental groups. And they only differed on whether or not they received algorithmic recommendations. So these employers, they post a job, and then we give them recommendations about who they should hire. So there was a model that tried to infer what employers' preferences would be. So we took the job attributes, which was the skills that were required, what category it was posted in. We took the worker attributes, so did they have the right skills? Had they worked on ODS before? Had they recently been indicated they were looking for work? So were they actually searching? Was there actually some indication that they were available? And then the output of that algorithm was a rank ordered list of contractors to recommend. So this was what the interface looked like. Here's the skills listed in the employer's job posting. Here's some recommended workers, details on them down to their feedback, narrative from past jobs. And then the employer could invite them if they wanted to. So we weren't forcing them to invite this worker. We're just giving them the option. Essentially, you should think of it as a subsidy for recruiting. So one thing that's important with ODS, workers either apply to a job organically, so they see a vacancy, they send their application, or the worker is recruited to apply by an employer. So this is their headhunted, right, where someone comes out and says, hey, you should apply to this job. So this recommendation experiment was really operating in this part of the market where you're taking the employer and saying, hey, that's the person you should try to get for this job. That was the nature of this intervention. So employer posts a job to the marketplace, randomization, control and treatment group. The controls shown nothing special. The treatment's shown this algorithmically recommended candidates. Employer may invite them, and then we get to see what happens. Do they fill their job? What was the match like, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so here are the results. Actually, if I could just see how I'm doing on time. Okay. Okay, so here's maybe a little bit hard to read, but so whether or not they took us up on the intervention, did they recruit when we showed them this, it substantially increased the fraction. It was 6% level off of a base of 15%. So this is it substantially increased the fraction of employers that were recruited anyone at all. It did not significantly increase the fill rate overall. It was higher, but it wasn't statistically significant. And then there's really nothing to be said about whether or not they hired an organic applicant or recruited applicant. Okay, but this is just pooling everything together. What I found was that the effects were actually dependent on whether or not the vacancy was a technical vacancy, so it was a computer programming job, or was it just sort of a data entry job. And there, when you break it down that way, you get a very different story. Among the technical vacancies, we get a substantial increase in the fill rate. And we get a substantial increase in the fraction that hired one of our recruited applicants. Nothing going on like that with the non-technical vacancies. So it seemed to have a very heterogeneous effect. Now, one thing so treatment increased the uptake of recruiting across the board. It increased the fill rates for technical vacancies. There was no effect on match quality, and surprisingly, there was no crowd out. Now, if I had to explain why the treatment only worked for technical vacancies, I think there's some economically relevant facts. Technical vacancies just receive far fewer organic applicants, on the order of 40% less. There's just fewer of these kind of highly skilled people. Whereas with these non-technical vacancies, there's a lot of people that apply to these jobs. I think what's going on is that the marginal applicant is just worth more to someone who has a technical vacancy. The market's thinner on the other side, so our recommendations, both sides acted on them, but they were only really valuable in one side where you actually had a detectable effect. The other thing is the lack of crowd out is surprising. You kind of would think that it would mechanically crowd out someone. If I recommend one person, someone else is going to not be hired, right? We should see a negative. In fact, it was positive. Not quite significant, but it was close, which is very, very counterintuitive. You would really expect that to be a negative effect. What I think happened, and I have some evidence to support this, is that by having recommendations in my pool, it sort of increased the value of this pool as a whole, and it kind of increased the amount of screening that happened on the extensive margin. So you can kind of think of it, say, like a university that's doing a search. They get their in-paper resumes, and nothing looks very promising. They call off the search. They get it. One of the resumes is for a superstar, someone who they really would like a chance to hire. They go forward with the search. Now maybe the superstar turns out to actually not be so good, but that person who also was in that pool, who on paper wasn't very good, ends up getting hired. So you can have a case where the recommending someone can actually increase the probability that other people get hired, even though kind of our intuition is that that's not the case. Now, this is my hypothesis that can explain the data, and I've got a model that makes this as a prediction, but I wouldn't say that's an experimentally derived result.
Could you explain one more time how your design actually measured the crowding now?
So you can just see whether or not one of your recruits got an organic applicant got hired. So if you see that number go down in the treatment, that's what you would expect to happen. It actually goes up. So organic applicants are more likely to be hired in the treatment.
So both organic applicants and the applicants that were recommended
are more likely to be hired.
Wow.
And it's not a case of sort of multiple hires. It was almost everyone in the data set was just hiring a single person. Okay.
So that was because the number of vacancies was decreased.
Number of vacancies?
Of unsuccessful advertising of
yes, yes,
not fulfilled.
Exactly. So there was a gross increase in the fill rate, and it was partly explained by hiring of more more recommended people, and partly explained by hiring of more organic applicants. Okay, so reducing congestion. So a market can become congested when people have to make too many decisions in too short amount of a time. Now, this is something that Al Roth, who's an economist, won the Nobel Prize last year, has done a lot of work on markets where they either unravel or you don't get as good a match as you can because people have too many choices to make. So the problem on Odesk, and I think this is probably a more general phenomenon, I think, is that because these markets are computer mediated, the cost of an application is very, very low. It's very cheap for me to apply to lots and lots of jobs. You can kind of see this in the United States, at least with college applications. Universities have moved to a common application. Another application is just very, very cheap. This also happens in the academic job market. You just apply everywhere that's got an opening, regardless of whether or not it's much of a special fit for you. And I noticed this happens. So a job can easily get hundreds of applicants, particularly for low-skilled work. And so either employers, within the company there were sort of two hypotheses about why this was bad. So either employers can quickly become overwhelmed with the quantity that they receive, and it becomes hard to pick out sort of that excellent needle applicant from the pool, or in response to this high number of applications, the individual worker chooses to not put much effort into any particular application. So this would be sort of spamming everyone with the exact same cover letter and not really thinking much about whether or not you'd be a good fit. So there's no sort of information revelation that I'm applying to your job, which means that I've thought about if I'm a good fit and that's why I'm applying. So it's kind of sort of two competing hypotheses about what's going on. There's some justification for both. So this just shows the number of applications that a vacancy receives, and this is the fraction of those applications that the employer even bothers to look at. So we can see whether or not they opened up. And you can see across the board, it's just this downward sloping. You get a lot of applications, you start ignoring people. And the problem, and I just alluded to this earlier, but the problem, it's not just quantity, it's also quality. So a generic cover letter, it gets talked about by employers as if they call it spam. Now this isn't spam like, hey, come buy Viagra or something like that. It's spam of just they're getting this very generic, obviously templated cover letter, and they complain about this all the time. So to see, is there some merit to what they're saying? Well, we can actually quantify this complaint, because for every worker, we know the whole sequence of job applications that they send. So we can actually take their cover letter and compare it to the last one they sent, and then get a measure of sort of the distance between these two, the sort of the edit distance. What would it take to turn this cover letter into this cover letter? And so I did that, and what you can see, so this is just predicting who gets hired. These are all just regression coefficients. And this is just my letter of cover similarity. I don't want to get too big, but the bottom line is, if you only had one thing to predict whether or not someone was going to get hired, you'd want the cover letter similarity. It's the best predictor by far, more so than their education, their feedback. I mean, it's just like this really, really silver bullet predictor, which is surprising. And then you can even just see this by plotting it, right? This is the fraction of probability of receiving an interview. And then this is the fraction of words in common between the current cover letter and the most recent cover letter. And you get this downward, clearly downward sloping. As you get more novelty, you're more likely to be hired. Okay, so is this causal? Is this just selection? I mean, you could just imagine crummy people send lots of spammy cover letters. Or is there something about sending a good cover letter that is revealing, that causes the match? So we instituted a treatment where we force applicants to answer questions when applying. And the questions are things like, why are you a good fit for this job? What project have you done in the past that's the best for this kind of thing? So they were generic questions that would require a customized answer, essentially trying to force people to write a customized cover letter even if they didn't want to. So we allocated all new vacancies on ODS to treatment and control groups. And then we varied the dose in the sense of like the number of questions you had to answer to get through this to actually apply. And we also varied the information disclosure. And this was really the key thing we were trying to do to separate between these two hypotheses. In one cell, we actually passed on the answers to the employer, and another one we didn't. So if we thought there was something about the content of the cover letter that was driving the result, then passing on the information, we should see it. We should see the effect. If it's actually just culling the number of applicants, then we should see the effect even if we don't pass on the information. So the treatment was designed to really test between these two hypotheses. And what we found was, one, there's definitely sort of some elasticity in that, the higher you raise the price of applying, the less applications you get. So these are just the number of questions. You can see this like clear downward sloping. Ask a lot of questions, you're going to get fewer applicants. Big reduction. What we found was that there was no difference in the fill rate, which, and I don't have a slide for this, but which is sort of surprising. Like, we knocked the number of applications down by about 20%, didn't move the fill rate at all, which was surprising. What we also found, though, was that when we passed on the answers to the questions, we formed better matches. And by better, I just mean higher dollar value. These, like, people found someone who they stuck with longer and spent more money. But it only happened when the actual answers were passed on. So it seemed to be an informational effect. That really the employer was taking and making decisions on the basis of the content of these questions. And when they did that, they ended up picking someone who lasted longer. Just reducing the number of applicants was not enough. Yes, so we reduced the number of applicants by about 20% with no ill effects on fill rates. Showing more information to employers helps them make a better match. Reducing the pool itself was not per se good. Okay.
But
yes?
So the problem compared to a normal letter which the person chooses to write is here we are forcing them to answer the questions, whereas if I write my own cover letter, I will only speak about, my great looks, but not the quality of my work.
Yes. So essentially what we're trying to do is still get the same selection effect of we're giving people who went through the trouble, and then we're just seeing, of the people who went through the trouble, how important is revealing that information in terms of the employer's actual decision making. That was sort of the sort of logic of the experiment.
Could it be that the benefits of the reduced number of applications are not something that you'd necessarily see in the fill rate, but it could still have benefits? Like now, since hiring is cheaper in terms of effort, you might actually be opening up more vacancies.
Yeah, there's a whole sort of host of other analyses that I want to do on this.
Right.
So talk to me in January when I have a draft
sure.
ready to go. But I think that there's some very interesting questions. I mean, even if you didn't move anything, reducing the number of applicants in the marketplace by 20%, but doesn't affect anything, you've just saved everyone a lot of time, right? And that in itself may be something worthwhile.
Yeah, but there is an assumption about the equivalence of hires. So do you have a sense of how the evaluation of the relationship after the fact
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of
Is it
measures
the same people that are being hired for the same fill rate?
So you're wondering, are you getting like a different type of person, right?
Right.
So it's not showing up, at least in the spend. I haven't seen any sign that they're different based on the feedback that they give them, the number of raises, the number of bonuses. But I think an honest answer to that is like I don't even know if I would have the statistical power to detect these. A lot of these are not measures that would kind of lend themselves to very easily. Like on every online site, the feedback distribution is very compressed.
Yeah.
So you're not going to have a lot of variation.
Everyone's 5 or 1.
Exactly.
Or 0.
Let me talk about the last one, and then I want to talk about some public policy. So markets solve coordination problems. So I noticed. Actually, how am I doing on time? Okay, I still have a half hour, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so employers take markets do something very nice, which is they help us coordinate. So you can find the sort of the double coincidence of wants and what you have, bring them together. So I noticed that the hotel that I'm staying at used to be called Horsemonger Street, and right now it is Corn Market Street. So you have the city actually serving at this coordination function, saying, if you want to trade this thing, this is where you go to trade it. Online markets do something similar, but they don't have geography to help coordinate. Coordinating on the thing that's being offered is an interesting problem, but it's something where both sides sort of have an incentive to say, yes, I'm looking for horses, yes, I'm selling horses. What they may not have an incentive to do is tell you, I'm looking for a very nice horse, or I'm looking for a very bargain basement horse, right? Employers, there's reason they might be strategic about revealing their preference for price and quality. And the reason they're going to care about it is you worry about being taken advantage of. If I say I'm in the market for a high-priced horse, I might get a low-priced horse that's just being sold to me at a high-priced horse. It really kind of comes down to the extent to which people can sort of figure out what's being bought and sold. So if you take and you make employers state their preferences, you might get more of the right kind of applicant, say. If I say I'm high or low type, you might get more sorting of the right kind of people. Or you might just get the wrong kind of pretending to be the right kind. So this is kind of, you can think of this as just, are you going to get this bad equilibrium where the high types just get taken advantage of and then they stop saying they're high types because all that does is cause you to pay a higher price. So what we're really trying to do is create a separating equilibrium. So we did an experiment where we forced all employers to say, are you looking for entry level, intermediate, and expert? And we tell the employer we might reveal this trade-off. Because you worry about people selecting something on the basis of their knowledge about what's going to be revealed. We have some cells where we do that as well, but the main point here is that the employer doesn't know if their choice is going to be revealed. And then to the control, so in the treatment, we reveal the choices to the job seekers. We say, hey, this is a high type, this is a medium type, this is a low type. And in the control, we don't reveal their choices. So the employer, we know the employer's type, but the workers don't. So the results, there's people are willing to reveal their types, and there's tremendous amount of heterogeneity in people's preferences across the market. So I know this is too small for you to read. Hopefully maybe the slides are online, you can see it. But essentially, you have some people who are really bargain basement. They're looking for the lowest tier in the admin stuff. And then in, say, something like software development, you have a lot more people who have very high type preferences that are actually looking to pay for high quality. So do we actually get sorting? Do we actually get better matches? Too early to tell. So maybe you can check out this paper in a couple months when it's actually written. But early signs indicate that it's a mixture of both. You get a fair amount of sorting, and you also get a fair amount of strategic bidding by workers who know that the employer is not as price sensitive, and they mark up their bids accordingly. Okay. So any questions on the experimentation side?
Employers will be able to say that the workers' past price history, though, so they will be able to identify those who've marked up their prices.
That's true. It'd be interesting to see how past price history sort of mediates the markup. Right?
Right.
I think that's a really good point. Yes.
In order to be able to study a fruit fly, you need to be able to approach it and so on. But did you have any problem getting ODEC to accept that you make experiments of things about ODA?
No, I was a full-time employee when I did this. This was sort of, this was part of my job, right? So I had to make the case. The company sort of intuits that it has these problems, right? They don't necessarily, no one's going to say we need a separating equilibria, but that's essentially what they said. We need a separating equilibria. So I kind of was in the role of, can I design an experiment that'll answer these fundamental questions before we roll something like this out?
If you had been working or undertaking study for NYU, do you think that you would have had trouble with your
IRB? I don't think so. Sorry, so the question is, would this have gotten past the IRB? You know, I had a lot of experience with the IRB when I was running experiments on Mechanical Turk. And I think the perspective I would have is that, look, like a drug trial, you know, we don't know, we think that this is going to help. That's why we're doing it. But, you know, I can't guarantee you that it's going to help. You know, I do think like creating a separating equilibria is good for this marketplace. I think a pooling equilibria on the whole is bad, right? So I think that, you know, the argument has to be, look, I think this will teach us something and the goal is positive. Now, whether or not that comes in actually makes people better off, you know, this is why we have to do experiments. But, you know, even not doing an experiment is a choice, right? And a choice that can have bad consequences as well. But I can tell you in a couple months when I start trying to get things past the NYU IRB.
But I mean, I think another question is, what do the participants think?
Yeah.
And that's not, I mean, I'm not saying that in a negative way, I'm just saying that's a fact.
So they love this feature. This is actually something that they complain about terribly, right? That they apply to jobs that the employer would never hire them because they were either a peanut farmer, someone who's looking to hire really low-priced people, or, you know, they never have a chance because this guy only hires experience. So at least anecdotally, they really wanted this feature. Now, the cover letter one, that was much less popular. But, you know, again, the goal was to move the market into a better equilibrium. And, you know, workers always had the choice of not applying to jobs that, you know, had a lot of questions attached to them, right?
Well, but that's not the issue. I mean, the issue is whether you're allowing people to have consent about when they're being experimented upon.
Well, so I think from an academic perspective, yes. I think that, you know, you have. I mean, this is what IRBs are for, right? I think from a company's perspective, what the company does with its own users, it's in the terms of use. You know, I think that as social scientists, I think we kind of pay attention to IRBs. And, you know, most of the things we're doing are like, well, we're going to try to make you more money, or we're going to try to improve your experience in some way. And, you know, this is an IRB that's used to people like, we're going to give you these potentially dangerous drugs to treat some condition you have. I mean, in a sense, I think that these are actually quite small stakes compared to the social benefit that we could potentially get by advancing social science.
Just to follow up on it, do you have a sense of how many of the people who use this service are dependent on it for their income? I mean, you mentioned, for example, PayPal goes down in India for 2 weeks.
Right. Yeah, no, I don't know how many people that this is like their essential thing, but, you know, I think the implication I take from that is, say it's really high, it's like, boy, we better get this right.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so policy. First, some cold water. So estimates suggest that online work industry was worth about $1 billion in 2012. Americans spent about $2.4 billion last year on Halloween candy. Okay, this is not. I'm not saying this to make fun of Halloween or online markets. My point is that it's not even remotely important in any kind of like macro policy sense. That this is, you know, large numbers of people are engaging in this kind of work, and we need to sort of pay a lot of attention to it yet. So why discuss it? Well, I think there's a couple justifications for talking about policy here. One, so if online work were to become very important, I would say that our existing regulatory apparatus would be flummoxed. Most labor law is designed for a very different kind of work. The second is, I think anytime you have some sort of new development that lets you think about the social costs and social benefits, especially one like this, which I think in some ways very clearly highlights sort of these equity efficiency trade-offs, it's just useful to think through them. And potentially, when we think about it, we might get some more generalizable insights. And lastly, I think that online work is potentially an important tool for economic development, which I'll talk more about at the end. So at least in the US, much of social policy is mediated by labor markets. And what I mean by that is, so, you know, it's used as a channel to deliver benefits and carry out redistribution. Okay, so you can think of like tax-advantaged employer provided health benefits, the minimum wage. There's several other examples of things where the labor market is sort of used as the channel. Employers are often used as third parties. that help with verification to cut down on things like fraud and adverse selection. So, for example, an employer is given partial responsibility for making disability payments. So they have sort of a financial incentive to make sure that they're not getting taken advantage of. They're an easily auditable entity for for earnings verification. I can come to an employer and say, did this person work here? How much were they earning? We generally think of firms as having superior record keeping versus sort of an individual. And they're also used for pooling for social insurance. So people come together, presumably to work. We might feel okay about extending insurance to them, as opposed to we came together because we're like a high risk group, right? Oops. So this verifiable stake in the ground is often used to implement means testing in the U.S. So things like the EITC, which is actually one of the major U.S. anti-poverty programs. It's based on someone's labor market income. Medicaid, employment insurance, all these things are sort of used, the labor market records are used as the stake in the ground to implement social policy. And in principle, this would extend to self-employment. In practice, when someone who's self-employed tries to claim the earned income tax credit, at least in New York State last year, something like 1/5 of them were audited, right? And they don't have the records. It looks scammy, right? They don't have this sort of verification thing that's provided by permanent employment with a recognized firm. So, what's the response to this? I don't really know. I mean, if you thought that people were going to take and freelancing was going to become a really big deal, I think theoretically it would suggest that a more state to individual social policy would make more sense. So something more like the National Health Service as opposed to employer-provided employment, right? If people are going to take and be moving around fractionally to lots of different employers, some of these things that are now provided by employers would seem to make more sense to come through some different entity.
Isn't freelancing a big deal in the U.S.? I think it's a double-digit percentage of the workforce who are self-employed, so like 30% or something. I mean,
I think with the Great Recession, there has been a lot of increase in self-employment.
Right.
It's not clear how much of that is true self-employment, like entrepreneurship, or just sort of like a default other, because I am still looking for work. I still want to find some kind of formal employment. But right. This is true. Like that I think it's freelancing or self-employment. It's a bad fit for how we deliver benefits in the United States, at least. I can't say that this is a general phenomenon in every country, but at least in the U.S. it doesn't work out very well. So we're talking about equity versus efficiency. So so many policy questions sort of come down to this question of equity versus efficiency. And I think that, imagine we have sort of an old income distribution where these are the highs, this is medium, and this is low. I think we wish it looked like this in the U.S. It's far, far more skewed. But and now we have some change that occurs where we're going to say it's efficient, and that these two blocks are better than this one block. But notice this guy gets a block, and this person who used to have two only gets a half. So this is an efficient but inequality increasing change. It's a non-Pareto improving change. Someone is clearly made worse off. So I think when I was talking about sort of what are the labor market effects of something like this, this might be the model you have in mind, where someone who would have been employed, now their job goes overseas. Okay. But this conception, it often depends on this very national definition of inequality. So if this is the country I have in mind, when I think about trade, there is this other country that is the partner that we're trading with, but generally we don't think of their outcomes. We kind of think of the sort of the returns to trade in terms of our own domestic country, and maybe we think about the returns, well, they're probably going to capital in that other country. The other workers really aren't, other firms aren't clearly entering into a sort of moral calculus about how we think about changes. But I think what you would see is that it could be very progressive if we extend our definition of what this income distribution is. So if you think about you're hiring workers in some other country, Bangladesh, Philippines, whatever, you're really not targeting sort of the high end, the owners of capital. You're actually kind of drawing from the lower part of the distribution. Now, as I've drawn this, this still is not Pareto improving, right? Someone's still made worse off. In fact, it's this low end in the U.S. distribution. But it's still more attractive to someone who has cosmopolitan views, but still inequality averse. So I think that you're still left with this fundamental question about how much weight do you put on other people different parts of the income distribution. What do I think a marginal dollar is worth to different parts? But I think if you start to think about a place where the other party in the country you're trading with is primarily labor, and probably drawn from the lower income distribution, you probably think about it a little differently. And this is related to this. Yes?
Can I ask you a question?
Mm-hmm.
What about, I mean, you say that in this case, well, what you mean, the second part would be directly the labor in another country.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, as far as I know, there are many, let's say, firms or companies in India which actually, I mean,
so
the worker looks like an independent worker, but actually is like a
yeah, so I think that I would put that into offshoring or trade. I'm specifically talking about employment relationships, right? So I'm hiring an individual worker, not hiring a firm. Now, I mean, even if I'm hiring a firm, right, there's some distribution that some of the money's going to the owners of capital and the firm's managers, some is going to the workers. I think like the argument still is relevant about who's actually getting what. But I think with an employment relationship, it's much easier to identify sort of who's the counterparty.
So there's a big difference between the traditional BPO model of offshoring work to India or Philippines versus Odesk model where you're directly employing somebody.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit psychological in the fact that it's mediated by this firm. Right. I mean, still, like, I don't think BPOs are bad. Right. I think that they still have this nice property of money from relatively wealthy people going to people who are relatively poor. But I think with direct workers, it's not even mediated. It's just this very direct consequence.
And so you're saying because of that, we should approach them a little bit differently. We should take them better into account in our moral calculus than when we're using a BPO, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I would agree with that. I'd go back to my initial candy corn point, which is that I still think that this is so small that to say like this should be our policy perspective. I'm not sure that's what I would say that yes, we need to have a policy perspective. I'm just saying I think conceptually how we think about it can be a little bit different. So going back to geography and institutions, so I'm getting a lot of mileage out of North Korea in this talk as my sort of straw man. Badly geographically divided place. But I think anyone would agree that institutions and geography matter. Okay, and states do a pretty good job of ensuring that the law of one price does not prevail. Anywhere, it's not easy to travel around the world, especially if you're from a poor country and you want to come work in a wealthy country.
Of course, it's not just states, is it? I mean, even within a country where you don't have border controls, people are very reluctant to move because of their social networks and other.
Yeah, no, I think that there's lots of reasons why people migrate or not, but in a lot of cases they don't even have the choice. Right? They're just sort of stuck where they are. It's not a meaningful trade-off. Right?
Well, I guess North Korea works as an example there.
Yes, North Korea is a wonderful example of lack of mobility. The best research on this says that the gains for more liberal migration could be enormous. I mean, as it is, remittances or something like 3 times direct foreign aid, right? This is people working in some country sending money home to their other country. The estimates to say, okay, how much benefit would you get from more liberal migration? The numbers are enormous, right? This one study in particular, they looked at every country in the world. What would be the real wage gain by letting that worker say move to the U.S.? The modal number of the factor, a multiplier, was 8. Meaning that a worker would get an 8x, no human capital difference, would get an 8x increase in real earnings by moving to a place where there was more demand for their skills. This is not an easy political sell, right? You don't really see a lot of political parties that are advocating for open borders, right? These are just some sort of Tea Party people with the
official language,
of course, wrongly spelled sign. It's not an easy political sell. But work works. So here's a collection of recent studies. So micro-enterprise, making grants to males, making grants to females, some conditional cash transfers. This is Nicaragua. This is Progresa, which is a Mexican program. Another microfinance study. This one up top that had this huge family gains was letting people from Tonga migrate to New Zealand to pick kiwis for the summer.
So these are different interventions aimed at increasing employment.
Right, or increasing sort of well-being. The point here is that letting people sell their labor seems to be a highly effective way. Giving them access to buyers in rich countries seems to be a highly effective way raising people's real earnings. So this is ODS mean wages versus country minimum wages. I'm using country minimum wages as a proxy for sort of what do we think of as sort of the bottom tier of earnings in that country. Now this data is from Wikipedia. Good luck trying to get harmonized minimum wage data across the country. I think Wikipedia might be the best we have. But you can see, up for like US, UK, Canada, Australia, it's no great shakes. Like these are people they're being earning about what the minimum wage is. This is a log scale, by the way. But look at Bangladesh. The minimum wage in Bangladesh is 10 cents an hour. The average worker on Odesk from Bangladesh is making $4 an hour. That's a 40x increase. Now, it's not to say that everyone in Bangladesh could get that kind of work. I couldn't tell you exactly where in the income distribution those people are, but this is on the face of it a pretty remarkable number. 40x is not kind of the, usually we think of interventions as 1.2x, maybe. Usually an imprecisely estimated one. Same thing with the Philippines. So the Philippines sort of dominates a lot of the sort of low-end work in the marketplace. The mean, and it's a bit higher than this, but $3 an hour, that would put you comfortably upper middle class in the Philippines if you could work for $3 an hour at 40 hours a week. It's just that by estimating the income distribution in the Philippines. So I think that online work, it's got very few institutional requirements. You need an internet connection. You need a way to receive payments. It doesn't require local entrepreneurial activity. You don't need the institutional framework where someone's starting businesses. You basically just need that these workers can get online and contact buyers in wealthy countries. Presumably safe working conditions. We all saw the horrible fire and building collapse in Bangladesh that killed excess of 1,000 people. People online, even if they're doing something like RSI is sort of the biggest occupational hazard of this kind of work. And you can see this in Odesk when you ask sort of what's great about Odesk. Particularly women with small children, they can kind of economize on childcare. They don't have to go anywhere. It seems to be very attractive for them.
If I may, I suppose one additional benefit of not having to have sort of local entrepreneurial presence is that you don't have to deal with corrupted officials that in many of these poorer countries are big impediment to economic activity. So
yes,
basically, you don't need a permit from anyone, so you don't really need to
yes, I mean it's
seek patronage from someone.
That's right. It's kind of a knock on very macro interventions in a country. So the World Bank gives money to a country to build a dam or something like that. Is that you think a lot of that benefit is sort of siphoned off by corruption, right? And here you kind of have a very direct people paying people.
Right.
I think that there's less potential for that.
Another point about the particularly attractive to women with small children. Roslyn Jill from King's College published some years ago a study of people in, I think they were UK, sort of cultural, people in cultural professions, very flexible work, home-based work and so on. And there also the assumption was that this kind of home-based work and flexible work would be reducing inequalities,
yes.
Be good for them. But actually her conclusion was that this flexibility, in some cases, it actually exacerbates inequalities, and that structured, very sort of structured working lives where you have strict office hours, they are actually inequality reducing. And the explanation for this was that if you have the social norm that women are expected to stay home with children, giving them a flexible job that allows them to do that, then actually means that they have no option but to sort of submit to that norm. Whereas if the employer requires them to be at the workplace certain hours, then maybe within family they will have to come up with alternative arrangements and share the burden. So
I think that the question is, does that structured job with presumably high quality daycare counterfactually exist? Right? So you think someone who's working online, they can kind of have the kids around and work, and maybe they end up both working and doing more housework. I think the question I would ask is, in the absence of that online work, would they be just watching the kid, or would they have this structured alternative? I don't know. this is something maybe we're doing sort of this worker survey would be very useful. Sort of what was your next best alternative? You know, what else were you considering other than this? Because I could definitely see the logic of sort of her study where you end up doing both as opposed to getting a break on one.
But of course, I mean, it's quite obvious that, you know, probably the answer that you expect is that these women wouldn't really have the opportunity of holding a full-time job and then having their husband take care of the kids instead. At least not in most cases, but in a way it relieves the pressure for any change to happen when you make it easy for women to actually fulfill that norm and that stereotype. So it's kind of complicated. To what extent is there? What extent are you focusing on improving their situation right now, as opposed to creating a sort of political conditions or demand for radical changes in social structure? You know.
Yes. I think,
and I don't think there is any clear answer to this.
No, I think we're kind of just sort of theoretically speculating. I think that more research is needed. You know, this isn't so I'm not the first person to point this out. So Samasource, which is a charity, is sort of organized around this notion that you can do these kind of business processes outsourcing in a very it's a very socially responsible way to sort of give work as sort of their tagline. So I'd say if I had to kind of sum up, I would say that these markets they're growing rapidly. I think they're interesting, primarily from a social science perspective, as a place to do research, to learn something more fundamental about economics. I wouldn't say that they are important policy-wise, which makes me a little sad to say that I don't think that this is like something we should spend a lot of time thinking about. But you know, I think it does sort of starkly illustrate some interesting thoughts, and you know, there's a potential that this will become important in the future. But you know, it's always hard to predict the future. So that is my talk. I think I will probably have some version of this online, but now I'd like to take questions.
Let's first thank John for the excellent talk. Thanks very much. Well, as you can see, we're recording this, so we will certainly have the talk and the slides online in one form or the other.
Yes.
So 2 slides back, please. 3.
Yes.
I mean, there is also a policy relevance, I think, to you know, just not just online markets of this sort for labor, but also the kind of outsourcing, contracting, making work individualized. And I mean, I'm going to sound like a real pinko here, but you know, your first point there, few institutional infrastructural requirements. Yes, if you can avoid paying taxes and if you can avoid benefits, great. Now, your answer to that is, you know, the Bangladeshi who is 40 times as much as the minimum wage. Wonderful, but I mean, in Bangladesh there are also unions emerging that are demanding real wages and health benefits and other benefits. So, you know, it's kind of it's like Billy's question, who's good, you know, good Finnish person with proper benefits and so on. I mean, you know, that's very difficult to square, but the reason for, and I can see all the positive points as well, but the reason for raising it is that that also kind of has policy implications for any kind of work. It's kind of, because not just, I mean, you can also think of LinkedIn, you know, which works to some extent, as I understand it, I don't know this area, but by just harvesting, you know, the best CVs. We had a talk at the Chinese Internet Conference where, you know, Chinese firms are just saying, okay, we have these kinds of work to be filled. Let's harvest the data, you know, get people's CV and just hire them on a kind of automatic basis. Well, in that case, you know, that is a similar kind of de-institutionalized markets where there are benefits for employers, also for workers. But there are also huge downsides. And I mean, you're at a business school, so you don't necessarily have to address these, but I mean...
Well, I'd like to think of myself as an honest social scientist who's interested in policy. So, you know, I mean, what I meant by that few institutional infrastructural requirements, you know, if I was going to try to recreate sort of what exists, say, in Silicon Valley, in Bangladesh, there's a whole nexus of things that are missing, right? undercapitalized, not a kind of liquid labor force of people who are technically savvy. There's probably not the legal and regulatory framework that I could go and form a corporation, be ready to be sued. It is not easy to start a business that would gonna hire people on this kind of scope, right? So what I say by like a few institutional infrastructure requirements, what I mean is that in places where you think that workers might benefit from doing this kind of work, there's a lot of the things that are missing that we would think would be necessary for firms to fill that role. But I think your question is more, is this sort of undermining sort of like regulatory frameworks, kind of changing sort of hard-fought labor protections that are now undermined by this kind of work. And I think that's very possible.
With, $1 billion, that's a drop in the bucket. But
yeah, no,
if it's happening here plus in all these other places, then it's not a drop in the bucket. And if it's attractive, if it's as attractive as you say it is, then presumably it's going to happen more.
I think one thing that to keep in mind is that IT work has historically had, at least in the U.S., so I can only really speak to the U.S., has been very much, there's been very little unionization, right? So you look at Silicon Valley, there's essentially no unionization. California has incredibly liberal at-will employment laws, right? You can just sort of fire someone in 1 minute. Very, very weak protections on, say, like corporate IP, so it's very easy to go from one company to another and sort of, take stuff out of it. There's all these things that are just very like laissez-faire, right? So so I guess what I'm saying is I don't think within IT the same things that say existed sort of for industrial work are jeopardized because they don't exist.
Well, that's also partly because IT workers are really highly paid. They're highly technically competent. They have the highest wages. They've been a kind of really growing job market, and those people can afford health insurance. A Bangladeshi sitting at the other end of the line can't.
Well, but I think what that would tend to push is that the losers in this would be Silicon Valley, not the Bangladeshi. He doesn't have the job right now, right? If you thought that the main effect was sort of displacement, the people in Silicon Valley should be upset. The people in Bangladesh should be thrilled.
I'm not sure that's comparing like with like, because let me make it very concrete.
Sure.
If you took all this and you gave all these jobs to American workers, right? If you said this kind of online work, if you're going to be a company operating in the U.S., Odesk,
sure,
you must restrict yourself to the American labor market.
And what wages are we paying?
Well, in that case, you'd have to pay higher wages, presumably.
And would that happen?
I'm not sure.
If you start from the assumption that people are price takers, which I think is a fairly reasonable, and especially a very competitive market, it doesn't make sense to talk about wages in this as this sort of like, out of band, right? Like we just, imagine it's this, imagine it's that. It's going to be determined by local supply and demand. And most of the things that people are doing on Odesk, no market would exist for that in Silicon Valley. So I think the counterfactual of imagine them paying tech wages for all this kind of work, it's not a counterfactual that makes sense.
When Odesk started up, was it American workers for American companies?
No.
Always been. Yeah.
It's always been very buyers in the United States, UK, Australia, workers in developing countries.
Could I ask, by the way, those of you who are not acquainted with John, just for John's benefit to introduce yourself, just name and affiliation when you speak. But I think you already know. Sure.
Didn't you have a slide at the beginning on the number of work? I thought the number of workers from poor countries was still less than the number of workers from rich countries on Odesk.
No. So my slide may have been misleading, but it's definitely the case that more of the workers are from developing countries than wealthy countries.
No, I understood that there was basically only employers from rich
Yes,
countries.
sorry. So there's a substantial fraction of workers. So let me just, the geographic distribution of work, so some sort of stylized facts, is that the data entry, sort of lowest end work, is primarily done by people from the Philippines. Sort of mid-tier web development, I would say, sort of like basic HTML, CSS, India and Pakistan tend to dominate that. Higher end computer programming, so more skilled work, tends to be dominated by Eastern Europeans. I mean, these are stylized facts. You can find exceptions, but that's like a rough sort of breakdown. And then if you see people from the US, UK, Canada, Australia working here, they're either leveraging the fact that they speak perfect English and are in the same time zone. So there's a body of work that requires that kind of thing. And then you also see people who are doing very high-end, very, very high-paying work that, you know, they've chosen to be a freelancer because, you know, no single employer wants their very, very specialized skill.
But didn't your graph show UK and US close to average minimum wage?
Yeah, that's an average, right? So, like, I think,
right, so
and also that was a log scale, so it's a little confusing. I mean, you know, the minimum wage, the federal minimum wage in the US is like 7 whatever.
Yeah.
You know, and I think the Odesk average is probably not much higher than that, but that's a mixture of people, say, who are like working at home for probably right around the minimum wage.
Does that mean people in the UK, there's some working less than minimum wage?
In the UK, working less than the US minimum wage? Probably.
Yeah.
There's no one in the US working less than the US minimum wage because we don't allow it.
The UK's higher.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't think Odesk has ever been in a position of trying to sort of enforce other countries' minimum wages, only our own.
Interesting.
Can I just check that point? So in the US, if you're a US worker and you choose to work through Odesk, you cannot work without the US minimum wage?
I think that's right.
So I'd like to just take the very valid concerns that Ralph expressed and put them in a larger context here, because, and I talked about this with John before, because John is a little bit playing down, I believe, the significance of this phenomena as representative, as an extreme example of bigger shifts and trends that have been ongoing in US and European labor markets for the past 2-3 decades. So obviously job stability is decreasing, job tenures are shortening, the amount of non-standard employment arrangements such as part-time, fixed-term, remote and mobile work are increasing. Amount of work done through staffing agencies is increasing. Outsourcing, offshoring and similar phenomena are increasing. So in many ways, what way I see online labor markets are as the extreme example in really a general trend. They're just sort of a tip of the iceberg, so to say. And the same issues related to what does this mean for employment protections? What does this mean for the institutional arrangements around work and employment that have been developed in post-World War II Europe and to some extent the US? What does this shift mean for them in the future? Because clearly they don't seem to be compatible with the new world of work. And that's emerging or being constructed. So when we look at these issues that people on Odesk are encountering and perhaps some of the solutions that they are coming up with, then I think they're very valuable in thinking about the future of labor and job markets in general. Or if we find by looking at Odesk and mTurk that future that it seems to indicate is just unsustainable and is impossible, then it's an advance warning for us now to then try to somehow change that future before it's the norm.
The canary in the coal mine.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, you definitely see on Odesk workers that want to recreate something more stable, right? That even just from a purely economic perspective, with this like fractional employment with a lot of employers, there's switching costs, there's like search costs. You have to kind of be this little firm. And that's very unattractive. Like people just kind of want to come and work at something that's more stable than that. And you'll see workers take a huge discount in pay for longer projects, right? To get out of that sort of very fractional employment, right? So I think that there's something that's missing by this kind of notion that you're just going to be paired off with lots of different people. You know, that being said, you know, I think partly in our minds we kind of associate part-time, fractional, freelance, flexible employment with sort of very unpleasant, low-paying work. But, you know, you can think of examples that have all those adjectives still exist, but it's a very great job. You know, so say you're like a very successful Hollywood actor or something like that, right? You know, you go from project to project, but it's really wonderful.
Academics?
Potentially. So I wonder to what extent is it possible to put together an attractive career for someone that does have this sort of freelancing. My sense is that it would be a lot easier to pull off if more of social policy was not labor market intermediated. The fact in the U.S., even myself jumping from Odes to NYU, I was employed by one and then employed by the other the next day. I have spent many hours making sure there's no gap in my health insurance coverage with this, COBRA and forms and proof of this and proof of that, and it's just this kind of an enormous administrative burden that sort of serves no purpose other than to make labor markets less flexible, right?
That's an excellent learning then from online labor markets, that what you're saying, that we need to find other ways to mediate social policy. And I think another interesting finding is the way that the platform itself, even though some nation states are in some ways losing control over labor policy because you can do regime shopping, you can locate your factory wherever or even use online channels to procure work from wherever. But then these online labor markets themselves are emerging on the scene as new regulators with kind of international reach. And Odesk is very actively sort of implementing all kinds of policies. Obviously, those policies are rooted in their interests as a company. But I think that's really interesting to explore what kind of policies does a self-interested labor market then create, and whether there would be some way of introducing some kind of democratic control into that without breaking the business model.
I mean, this very much taking off my Odesk hat, right? I think it would be very bad for Odesk to become a monopoly, in the sense that, if one of the things that might tamp down any kind of platform exploitative behavior is that I can sort of venue shop, that I could, if this becomes too regressive, I could go to this other market where the rules are better, so people could sort of do the TiVo sorting into better things. But I think this notion of the platforms as sort of quasi governmental, I mean, the analogy is very good. I mean, they are sort of in the business of setting rules, setting policies to try to promote some end. Now, the ends that they care about are not democratic. The ends that they care about are the total wage bill. Now, that in some cases, I mean, so Odesk, for example, because they charge 10% of the wage bill, they have incentive to try to either raise wages or expand the size of the market. It's sort of indifferent between the two. Different sort of price structures would give them different incentives. So if they were to charge, say, employers a fixed member entry fee, so to participate in the market, you need to pay some amount. Their goal is to maximize the employer's surplus. That's very different. Push down wages doesn't matter. That's actually good. We can extract more. These are just design choices that the platform would make up front, which would radically shift how they think about what they're doing. I think something I'm interested in is, as you see more of these platforms emerge in all sorts of different markets, as they choose different incentive structures, how does it shape the choices that they end up making about things like price levels, policies, entry, exit, and kind of make some sort of a theory of marketplace building.
So that sounds like that would be an effective lever if I were a government and I wanted to somehow ensure that these platforms are enacting policies that that their interests are aligned with the workers' interests. I could try to buy policy. It would be quite invasive, but I could try to prescribe what kind of pricing models are allowed.
You potentially could. I mean, I think, sorry.
No, again, the area I'm particularly interested in is what online work could potentially do to the erosion of the traditional role. So I can look at job roles with tasks.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take the UK labour market at the moment, you've got about 42% of people who don't work in a full-time employed role. So that's kind of where we're at the moment. Then if you actually look at online work, we start to chip off bits of a role that people used to have as a full-time role into these smaller sort of tasks. You've actually got that erosion of work going on as well.
So I get the question would be, so I had some job that was composed of a series of tasks, none of which were outsourceable. Now I'm in a market that they can be split out. Do I do more of the remaining things? I don't know.
And the other really interesting thing for me is that the more this kicks, and engage workers on tasks through platforms. They have a deliverable, outcomes-based approach to this work, so they expect an outcome, they expect deliverables. Whereas if I hire a permanent employee, a full-time employee, I hire them. And there'll be some things in there that there's expectations, but my weekly or monthly wage doesn't actually mostly come through achieving a set of deliverables.
Right. I mean, so I think that the contractual structure of something where it's like a fixed price for some, we have some deliverable that we've contracted upon, it's risk shifting from the employer to the not employee, but the counterparty. I think that works actually very poorly online. Contract writing costs are very high. It's very difficult for me to specify a complete contract, especially for software, which is sort of like notoriously hard up front to say this is what I want done, right? It's just kind of defined by sort of changes. And what that does is it pushes people towards employment contracts where you work for some number of hours and I pay you and the risk is borne by me of non-performance. That is hard to do online because people don't want to contract upon inputs. So one of the things that always sticks in my mind, I once hired someone to edit a paper of mine. And I gave them the Microsoft Word document, and I got it back, and I was billed for 4 hours. And then I looked at like the timestamp between the most recent and the last and the first change, and it was like 25 minutes. I was billed for 4. And I thought, like, well, maybe they were sort of considering, sort of how should I approach this, and so I paid the bill, right? I'm not going to, but it sort of, I think it illustrates the point where it's very hard. Like I wouldn't do that again because I can't contract upon inputs. One thing that Odesk does, and a lot of these companies do this, is you put this sort of monitoring software on your computer. In exchange for this sort of Orwellian, if people can see what you're doing, well, we can now actually contract upon inputs. Where if I say I worked 3 hours, not only did I work 3 hours, but there's photographic, time-stamped, cryptographically ensured evidence that that was in fact the case.
Anything else? All right, I guess we'll just thank John for the excellent talk and thanks for entertaining our questions.
It was my pleasure. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.